The morning my husband's children locked me out of my own home, the sky was painfully clear. It felt wrong that the world could look so peaceful when my life had just collapsed. Robert had been buried only 3 days earlier. 3 days. That was all it took. I turned my car into the long gravel driveway of the house I had lived in for almost 20 years. The house Robert built when his property business began to flourish. The house where we had hosted family dinners, business parties, and quiet Sunday mornings with coffee on the back porch. Except something was wrong. 2 moving trucks sat in front of the garage. At first, I assumed Daniel had arranged them to move some of Robert's belongings into storage. But as I stepped out of the car, I noticed the front door was open. And standing in the doorway were Robert's twin children, Daniel and Clara. They were watching me like I didn't belong there. A cold unease settled in my chest. Daniel stood with his arms folded, leaning casually against the door frame as if he owned the place. Clara stood beside him, dressed in a sharp black blazer that looked more like a business outfit than something worn during mourning. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. If anything, they looked satisfied. I walked toward the steps slowly. "Why are there moving trucks here?" I asked. Clara exchanged a quick glance with her brother. Then Daniel stepped forward. "You're not coming inside," he said. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. "What?" Daniel's tone remained calm, almost bored. "The locks have been changed." My heart skipped. "Changed?" I repeated. Clara crossed her arms. "You heard him." I stared at them both, still trying to process what they were saying. "I live here." Daniel shook his head slowly. "Not anymore." A silence stretched between us. Behind them, I could see movers walking through the hallway carrying boxes. My boxes. My books. My life. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm. Daniel stepped down from the porch. He stopped just 2 steps away from me. Up close, his expression was colder than I had ever seen it. "Dad's gone," he said flatly. "As of now, everything in this house belongs to the Hale family." Clara added from behind him, "And that doesn't include you." For a moment I could only stare at them. After 20 years in that house, after helping raise them, after standing beside their father through every business crisis and family struggle, they were throwing me out. "Your father would never allow this," I said quietly. Daniel gave a short laugh. "Dad isn't here anymore." Clara stepped forward now. "We already spoke to a lawyer," she said. "The estate belongs to us." I noticed then that the neighbors across the street had stepped outside. Watching. Whispering. The humiliation of the moment pressed down on me like weight. "You could at least let me collect my things," I said. Clara's smile was thin. "You can collect whatever you brought today." Daniel added the final blow. "Everything else belongs to us now." For a moment I considered arguing. Screaming. Demanding they show me proof. But then something inside me shifted. I suddenly remembered Robert's voice months earlier in his study. "If anything ever happens to me, trust that I've taken care of things." At the time, I thought he was simply reassuring me. Now I wasn't so sure. I looked back at Daniel and Clara. The twins stood there with the quiet confidence of people who believed they had already won. Neither of them realized they were standing on a trap their father had built himself. So instead of arguing, I simply nodded. "Fine," I said calmly. Daniel looked almost disappointed by how easily I accepted it. I turned and walked back to my car. Clara called out behind me, "Don't bother coming back." I didn't respond. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse of the house in the rearview mirror. The house Robert loved more than anything. The house where he built his empire from a small office on the 2nd floor. The house his children had just stolen from his widow. But as painful as the moment was, something about it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something Robert had been preparing for long before his death. 20 years earlier, I met Robert Hale when I was 32 years old. He was already a successful commercial property developer by then. But when I first saw him, he didn't look like a powerful businessman. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. His wife had died 2 years earlier. Cancer. She left behind 2 14-year-old twins, Daniel and Clara. Robert was trying to raise them alone while running a rapidly growing business. We met at a charity dinner. I had been invited by a mutual friend who worked with Robert's company. He barely spoke that evening. But later, when the event ended, he walked over and introduced himself. His voice was quiet but steady. "I'm Robert Hale." "I know," I said. "Your reputation tends to arrive before you do." That made him smile. It was the first time I saw warmth in his eyes. We started talking. And somehow that conversation lasted 3 hours. Our relationship grew slowly after that. Robert was careful. Not because he doubted his feelings, but because he knew introducing someone into his children's lives would be difficult. He wasn't wrong. The first time I met Daniel and Clara, they barely spoke to me. Clara stared at me like she was measuring something she didn't like. Daniel didn't bother hiding his hostility. "You're not our mom," he said bluntly during dinner. Robert tried to correct him, but I stopped him. "It's okay," I said. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. That was the moment I realized something important. These children weren't just grieving. They were guarding something. Their father. And maybe the life they believed belonged only to them. Over the years, their hostility softened slightly. But it never disappeared. Even as adults, they treated me like an outsider. Someone temporarily occupying their mother's place. Robert believed time would change them. He was wrong. If anything, they only grew more distant. More resentful. Especially Daniel. Daniel had always been different from his sister. Clara was cold but calculated. Daniel was reckless. Impulsive. Ambitious in ways that often crossed the line into arrogance. Robert tried for years to guide him. He brought Daniel into the company. Gave him opportunities most young men could only dream of. But no matter what Robert did, Daniel always seemed to drift toward trouble. And sometimes, late at night when Robert thought I was asleep, I would hear him in his study, sitting alone, thinking, wondering where he had gone wrong. What I didn't know then was that Robert had been asking himself a much darker question for years. A question that began the night before his first wedding, and one that would eventually change everything he left behind. When you live with someone long enough, you begin to notice the things they never say out loud. Robert Hale was a strong man. A disciplined man. The kind of man who built an empire from a single office desk and a phone that never stopped ringing. But sometimes, late at night, I would see him sitting alone in his study long after the lights in the rest of the house had gone out. Just sitting there. Thinking. At the time I believed he was simply worrying about business. Now I know it was something much deeper. Something that had begun decades before I even met him. Robert told me the story once, though he never explained why it still bothered him. It happened the night before his first wedding. He had returned early from work and was walking down the hallway toward the bedroom when he heard his fiancée crying softly inside. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But then he heard her say something that made him stop. "Mom, I'm scared to tell him." Her voice trembled. "I don't know how he'll react. The marriage could be destroyed before it even begins." There was a long pause while her mother spoke on the other end. Robert said he remembered standing there frozen in the hallway. Then his fiancée spoke again. "Okay, Mom," she said quietly. "I'll listen to you." After that, the call ended. Robert never asked her about it. The wedding took place the next morning. And whatever secret she had been afraid to reveal, it stayed buried with her. At least, that's what Robert believed for many years. By the time I met Robert, Daniel and Clara were already 14 years old. Identical twins in appearance, though their personalities could not have been more different. Clara was observant. Quiet. She rarely spoke unless she had something precise to say. Daniel, on the other hand, filled every room he entered. Confident. Restless. Always chasing the next opportunity. Or the next mistake. Robert tried everything to guide him. Private schools. Business mentorship. Internships within the company. Nothing seemed to stick. Daniel was intelligent, no doubt about that. But he had a strange habit of choosing shortcuts. Shortcuts that often led to trouble. Still, Robert never gave up on him. He believed that one day Daniel would mature and grow into the responsibility of inheriting the company. For a while, it even seemed like that might happen. Until 5 years ago. At that time, Hale Properties had reached the point where every new project attracted serious attention from competitors. Robert had built a reputation for turning neglected commercial spaces into highly profitable developments. One particular project stood out. an old industrial property downtown that the city planned to redevelop. Whoever secured the contract would earn millions over the next decade. Robert personally oversaw the bid. The numbers were carefully calculated. Every cost, every projection, every risk factor. The final bid document was stored in a restricted internal file that only a few senior executives could access. Daniel was among them. At the time, Robert believed it was a good opportunity for his son to learn how major deals worked. The bidding process took months. When the final results arrived, Robert gathered the senior staff in the conference room. Everyone expected them to win. The numbers were strong. The projections were solid. The rival companies simply didn't have the same development experience. Then the announcement came. They had lost. Not by thousands. Not by hundreds. But by a few dollars. The room fell silent. Robert read the competitor's bid twice. Then a third time. His expression changed. The competitor's number fell precisely within the narrow margin Robert had calculated. A margin only someone who knew the internal estimate would understand. Someone had leaked their bid. The investigation began immediately. Robert was furious. The confidential document had been accessible only to a small group of executives. Daniel volunteered to assist with the internal review. At the time, Robert appreciated his enthusiasm. Within 2 days, Daniel announced he had identified the source of the leak. A junior employee named Thomas Reynolds. Thomas worked in a department that handled administrative files. Technically, he should never have had access to the bid document. Daniel claimed Thomas must have found a way to retrieve the file from a shared server. Without consulting Robert, Daniel fired him. Case closed. Most of the executives accepted the explanation. But Robert didn't. Something about the situation felt wrong. Thomas had worked at the company for 7 years. His record was spotless. And more importantly, Robert knew how their internal security systems worked. There was simply no way Thomas could have accessed that document. Unless someone else had allowed it. Robert tried to reopen the investigation. But Daniel insisted there was nothing more to uncover. Clara supported him. Together they pushed the narrative that the problem had already been solved. Eventually the matter faded from public attention. But Robert never forgot it. And the more he thought about it, the more that old memory returned. The conversation he overheard before his wedding. "Mum, I'm scared to tell him." For decades Robert had dismissed it as pre-wedding anxiety. Now, for the first time, he began to question it. What if it meant something else? What if the secret his fiancée never revealed had something to do with the children she was carrying at the time? Robert didn't want to believe it. But Daniel's behavior made it harder to ignore. And the possibility grew quietly in the back of his mind. Not long after the failed bid, Robert invited Daniel to the house for a private meeting. I remember that evening clearly. Daniel arrived just after sunset. Robert poured them both a drink in his study. They spoke for nearly an hour. Business talk, mostly. At least that's what Robert told me later. When Daniel left, Robert sat alone in the study for a long time. The next morning I noticed something unusual. Robert had carefully wrapped a drinking glass in a plastic bag. I assumed he was sending it somewhere for testing related to the company. I didn't ask. A few weeks later a sealed envelope arrived. Robert opened it while sitting at his desk. I watched his face as he read the contents. He didn't say a word. But something inside him seemed to collapse. Then he folded the papers slowly, placed them in a folder, and locked them inside the safe. I asked him what it was. He only shook his head. "Just some paperwork," he said. He never mentioned it again. And I never pushed him. But from that day forward, Robert began quietly making changes. Changes that no one else noticed. Except perhaps Daniel and Clara. Because suddenly, Robert stopped trusting them with important decisions. Stopped sharing sensitive information. Stopped preparing them for the leadership roles they had always expected. Instead, he began working closely with the company lawyers. Reviewing contracts. Revising estate documents. Putting safeguards in place that no one outside his legal team fully understood. I thought he was simply planning for retirement. Now I know the truth. Robert had discovered something that changed the way he saw his entire family. And he was preparing for a moment he believed would eventually come. The moment when his children would reveal exactly who they really were. And unfortunately, he was right. For years I believed Robert's silence meant peace. Now I understand it meant preparation. After that envelope arrived, the one he locked in his safe, something inside my husband changed in ways I could never fully explain at the time. Robert was not the kind of man who acted emotionally. He was careful, strategic, the kind of businessman who always looked 10 steps ahead. And suddenly he began behaving exactly like a man preparing for something inevitable. I just didn't know what. The first change I noticed was subtle. Robert stopped involving Daniel in major negotiations. Before then, Daniel had been slowly integrated into the company's leadership structure. Robert had hoped his son would eventually take over parts of the business. But after the failed redevelopment bid, Daniel's responsibilities began shrinking instead of growing. He was still technically a senior manager, but Robert no longer trusted him with sensitive financial decisions. At first, Daniel didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he simply assumed the situation would correct itself. But as the months passed, frustration started to show. I remember one evening when he stormed into Robert's study while I was sitting there reviewing some property reports. "This is ridiculous," Daniel snapped. Robert didn't even look up from the document he was reading. "What is? You've got me managing routine maintenance contracts while outside investors are negotiating major deals." Robert calmly turned a page. "That's the work assigned to you." Daniel laughed bitterly. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Now Robert looked at him. His expression was calm, but his eyes were cold. "What exactly do you think I'm doing?" "You're freezing me out," Daniel said. Robert leaned back in his chair. "Then prove I'm wrong." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, because for the first time in his life, his father was looking at him like a stranger. Daniel left without another word. But that was the night I realized something serious had broken between them. Clara handled the situation differently. If Daniel was fire, Clara was ice. She didn't confront Robert directly. Instead, she began visiting the house more often, bringing dinner, asking about his health, offering to help with company matters. On the surface, she seemed like the concerned daughter. But there was something about the way she observed Robert that made me uncomfortable. Like she was studying him, waiting. Robert noticed it too. One evening after Clara left, he poured himself a drink and said quietly, "Clara is patient." I looked up from the book I was reading. "That's not a bad thing." Robert gave a slow nod. "No," he said. "It's not." But his tone suggested he meant something else entirely. A few weeks later, Robert asked me to sit with him in his study. He had a stack of legal papers spread across the desk. "I'm updating some estate documents," he said. I smiled slightly. "You've been updating estate documents every year since I met you." Robert returned the smile. Habit of a cautious man. He slid one sheet of paper toward me. "Look at this." I glanced down. It was a summary of his ownership stake in Hale Properties. Robert personally owned 55% of the company. That majority stake gave him absolute control over every major decision. "What about it?" I asked. Robert tapped the paper thoughtfully. "If something happens to me, the company has to remain stable." "Of course," I said. "That's why you have a will." Robert nodded slowly. "Yes." Then he looked directly at me. "But a will alone isn't enough." I didn't understand what he meant. Robert leaned forward. "I want to make sure the company can never be taken over by people who don't understand what it represents." "You mean competitors?" I asked. He hesitated. For a brief moment, something dark passed across his expression. "Yes," he said. "Competitors." I accepted the answer. But now, thinking back, I realize he wasn't talking about outside competitors at all. He was thinking about the people inside his own family. Over the next few months, Robert worked closely with the company's lawyers. They visited the house often, sometimes staying for hours in the study with the door closed. I assumed they were reviewing business contracts. Robert never discussed the details, and I respected his privacy. But occasionally I caught fragments of conversation. Words like share allocation, transfer restrictions, minority protections. At the time, those terms meant little to me. Now they mean everything. Meanwhile, tension inside the company continued to grow. Daniel became increasingly aggressive. He pushed for expansion projects that Robert rejected. He argued with senior managers. Once he even attempted to negotiate a financing deal without Robert's approval. Robert shut it down immediately. Their relationship became openly hostile. And yet, despite everything, Robert never removed Daniel from the company completely. At first I couldn't understand why. Now I think I do. Robert wasn't trying to destroy his children. He was trying to contain them. Then came the night everything changed. It was late. Nearly midnight. I had gone downstairs for a glass of water when I noticed the light still on in Robert's study. He was sitting behind his desk staring at an open folder. The same folder he had locked away months earlier. When he noticed me in the doorway, he closed it immediately. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Neither can you," I said gently. Robert leaned back in his chair. For a moment he looked older than I had ever seen him. Tired. Burdened. "Margaret," he said quietly, "if something ever happens to me." I interrupted him immediately. "Don't start with that again." He smiled faintly. "Humor me." I sighed and walked into the room. "All right. What about if something happens to you?" Robert folded his hands on the desk. "I need you to promise me something." "What?" "No matter what Daniel and Clara say after I'm gone, don't believe everything you hear." I frowned slightly. That's a strange thing to ask. Robert didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened a drawer and took out a sealed envelope. He placed it in the desk safe. Then he locked it. The metallic click echoed softly in the quiet room. "Everything you need to know is already taken care of," he said. I studied his face carefully. "You're worrying too much." Robert stood and walked around the desk. He placed his hands gently on my shoulders. "I spent my whole life building something that was supposed to protect my family." His voice softened. "I just want to make sure it doesn't destroy you." At the time I thought he meant the business pressures, the legal responsibilities, the endless negotiations. Now I know he meant something far more dangerous. Robert had discovered the truth about his children, and he knew that truth would eventually reveal itself. 3 months later, Robert Hale died suddenly. The doctors said it was a heart attack. Quick, unexpected, natural. And 3 days after his funeral, Daniel and Clara changed the locks on the house. Standing in my friend Elaine's living room that evening, replaying the humiliation over and over in my mind, I suddenly remembered Robert's words in the study. "Everything you need to know is already taken care of." At the time I had assumed it was simply reassurance. Now I wondered if it meant something else. Something hidden. Something waiting. And somewhere, in a locked office safe at the company's legal firm, Robert Hale's final instructions were waiting to be read. Instructions his children had never seen. Instructions that were about to destroy everything they believed they had just taken from me. 3 days after Robert's funeral, Daniel and Clara locked me out of the house. 3 days. 20 years of marriage erased in less than a week. I spent that night at my friend Elaine's house. She kept insisting we call a lawyer immediately, but something inside me told me to wait. Robert had never been careless, and the calm confidence Daniel and Clara displayed that morning felt premature. 2 days later, the call finally came. Robert's estate attorney wanted everyone present for the formal reading of the will. The meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. The law office sat on the 12th floor of a quiet building downtown. When I walked into the conference room, Daniel and Clara were already there. Daniel leaned back in his chair like a man who had already collected his winnings. Clara sat beside him, scrolling through her phone with the same cold composure she always carried. Neither of them stood when I entered. Neither greeted me. Daniel only glanced up briefly. "Surprised you showed up," he said. I ignored him and took a seat at the opposite end of the table. The estate attorney, Mr. Whitmore, entered a few minutes later carrying a thick folder. He had worked with Robert for nearly 20 years. Unlike Daniel and Clara, his face carried none of their confidence. If anything, he looked uncomfortable. "Thank you all for coming," he said, taking his seat. Daniel leaned forward. "Let's skip the formalities," he said. "We already know Dad left everything to his family." Whitmore adjusted his glasses slowly. "Yes," he said carefully. "That is correct." Clara smiled faintly. But Whitmore continued. "However, Mr. Hale was extremely specific about how his estate should be distributed." Daniel waved a hand impatiently. "Just read it." Whitmore opened the folder. The room fell quiet. Robert's will began with the usual formal language. Personal possessions. Charitable donations. A few gifts to longtime employees. Daniel looked bored. Clara tapped her nails lightly on the table. Then Whitmore reached the section that mattered. The controlling ownership stake of Hale Properties currently held by Robert Hale totals 55%. Daniel straightened slightly in his chair. Whitmore continued reading. Under the terms of this will, the ownership distribution shall be as follows. He paused briefly, then said the words that changed everything. 45% of Robert Hale's ownership shall transfer to Margaret Hale. The room went completely silent. Daniel blinked. Clara's tapping stopped. Whitmore continued calmly. 5% shall transfer to Daniel Hale. 5% shall transfer to Clara Hale. For several seconds no one spoke. Daniel looked like someone had just slapped him. Then he laughed. A sharp, disbelieving sound. That's impossible. Whitmore calmly slid copies of the documents across the table. Mr. Hale signed this revision 14 months ago. Clara snatched her copy and scanned the page rapidly. Her face paled. Daniel flipped through the document, growing more agitated with each page. This is ridiculous, he snapped. Dad would never give her control of the company. Whitmore looked directly at him. Mr. Hale was very clear about his intentions. Daniel slammed the papers down. She manipulated him. I said nothing. Whitmore continued reading. And there are additional conditions regarding the shares granted to Daniel and Clara Hale. Daniel leaned back with a frustrated sigh. What conditions? Whitmore adjusted his glasses again. The 5% shares assigned to each of you cannot be sold or transferred to any outside party. Daniel frowned. What? Whitmore continued. They may only be transferred to your direct descendants. Clara looked up sharply. That makes no sense. Whitmore nodded toward the document. There is an additional clause. If either party attempts to sell their shares, Margaret Hale shall have the right of first refusal. Daniel's eyes narrowed. At what price? Whitmore answered calmly. No more than 10% above the prevailing market value. For a moment Daniel simply stared at him. Then realization hit. His voice rose. That means we can't sell to investors. Whitmore nodded. Correct. Clara leaned forward. You're saying we're stuck with these shares. Whitmore folded his hands. That was Mr. Hale's intention. Daniel pushed his chair back violently. This is insane. Whitmore remained calm. Mr. Hale wanted to ensure Hale Properties could never be taken over through hostile acquisition. Daniel's face had gone red. Hostile takeover by who? Whitmore didn't answer. But everyone in the room already knew the truth. Robert had designed the will to prevent anyone, including his own children, from controlling the company. Daniel turned toward me slowly. You knew about this. It wasn't a question. I met his gaze. No. That seemed to anger him even more. So you're telling me Dad just randomly decided to give you control of everything? Whitmore spoke before I could answer. Mr. Hale documented his reasoning very carefully. Daniel glared at him. Let me guess. Whitmore opened another page in the folder. Mr. Hale believed Margaret Hale was the only person capable of maintaining the company's stability. Clara laughed bitterly. She's not even blood family. Whitmore's expression remained neutral. Mr. Hale did not consider that relevant. Daniel stood up and began pacing. This is going to court. Whitmore shook his head slowly. You're welcome to challenge the will. But I should inform you that Mr. Hale prepared extensive documentation supporting his decisions. Daniel stopped pacing. What documentation? Whitmore hesitated briefly, then closed the folder. That information will only be presented if a legal challenge is filed. Clara stared at the papers in front of her. The calm mask she usually wore had cracked. You're telling us she controls 4 to 5% of the company? Whitmore nodded. Yes. And together we only have 10. Yes. Daniel laughed again. But there was no humor in it this time. Dad really did it, he muttered. Then he looked at me again. And this time his expression carried something new. Not just anger. Fear. Because for the first time he understood something important. The woman he had thrown out of the house 3 days earlier now controlled the empire he believed belonged to him. As the meeting ended, Daniel gathered his papers with stiff movements. This isn't over, he said. Whitmore simply nodded. Of course. Clara stood slowly. She looked at me with cold calculation. You think this means you've won? I held her gaze. I didn't come here to win anything. Daniel scoffed. Enjoy it while it lasts. Then the twins walked out of the conference room without another word. The door closed behind them. Whitmore leaned back in his chair and sighed quietly. Your husband was a very cautious man. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. He was. Whitmore studied me carefully. There's something else you should know. What? Whitmore hesitated. Mr. Hale believed his children might react badly to the will. I gave a faint smile. They already have. Whitmore shook his head slightly. I don't think you understand. He opened the folder one more time. Inside were several sealed envelopes. Robert left additional instructions, in case certain things happened after his death. A strange chill moved through me. What kind of instructions? Whitmore looked directly at me. The kind that suggest your husband believed someone inside his own family had already betrayed him once before. And for the first time since Robert's death, I began to wonder what secrets my husband had been carrying all those years. Secrets that Daniel and Clara clearly knew nothing about, but were about to discover. After Daniel and Clara stormed out of the conference room, the silence they left behind felt heavy. Mr. Whitmore remained seated across from me, his hands resting calmly on the thick folder that held Robert's will. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Finally, he exhaled slowly. Your husband anticipated today might be difficult. I let out a quiet breath. That's one way to describe it. Whitmore gave a faint, sympathetic smile. I've known Robert for 20 years. When he prepared this will, he was very deliberate. He tapped the folder gently, and he left more than just instructions about the company. My attention sharpened immediately. What do you mean? Whitmore opened the folder again and pulled out 3 sealed envelopes. Each one had Robert's handwriting across the front. The sight of it made my chest tighten. Robert's handwriting had always been precise. Strong. The handwriting of a man who liked order. Whitmore slid one envelope toward me. This one is addressed to you. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked it up. When did he write this? I asked. About a year ago, Whitmore replied. He asked that it only be delivered after the will was read. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Robert's voice almost echoed in my mind as I read his words. Margaret, if you're reading this, it means 2 things have happened. First, I'm gone. Second, Daniel and Clara have likely revealed exactly who they are. I'm sorry you had to face that. But I suspect you already knew what kind of people they had become. What you probably do not know is that I have spent the last 5 years trying to understand something that never made sense to me. The company bid we lost 5 years ago was not an accident. Someone inside Hale Properties leaked our numbers. At the time, Daniel insisted the investigation was complete. But I never believed him. And eventually I discovered why. The evidence you are about to receive will explain everything. You deserve to know the truth. Robert. My hands slowly lowered the letter. A strange mix of grief and confusion filled my chest. Whitmore quietly slid the second envelope across the table. This one contains the documentation he referenced. I opened it carefully. Inside were several printed financial records. Bank transfers. Email logs. Phone records. I stared at the pages as the pieces slowly began falling into place. One document showed a transfer of nearly $200,000 into an offshore account. The account holder's name was Daniel Hale. Another document showed communication records between Daniel and an executive from the rival company that had won the redevelopment bid. My heart sank. This can't be real, I whispered. Whitmore spoke gently. Robert spent years collecting that evidence. I flipped through the pages again. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. Daniel had leaked the company's confidential bid information, and the rival firm had paid him for it. But why didn't Robert expose him? I asked. Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair. Because by the time he confirmed it, he was already dealing with another discovery. What discovery? Whitmore hesitated. Then he reached into the folder one last time. He placed a thin document on the table. A medical laboratory report. I stared at it. Then slowly read the heading. DNA paternity analysis. My breath caught in my throat. Robert asked me to keep this sealed unless it became necessary, Whitmore said quietly. My hands felt cold as I read the results. 2 names were listed on the report. Daniel Hale. Clara Hale. Both followed by the same conclusion. Probability of paternity, 0%. For a moment the room seemed to tilt slightly. You're saying, I whispered. Whitmore nodded slowly. Robert confirmed it 5 years ago. The same year as the leaked corporate bid. Suddenly Robert's strange behavior during those last years made sense. The quiet distance. The cautious legal planning. The coldness toward Daniel during business meetings. He hadn't simply suspected betrayal. He had discovered the truth about the twins themselves. They weren't his children, I said softly. Whitmore shook his head. No. And yet he never told them. No. I leaned back in the chair, my thoughts racing. Robert had carried that secret alone for 5 years. He had known Daniel betrayed him. He had known the twins were not his biological children. And still, he never publicly exposed them. Instead, he built something far more devastating. A legal trap. He left them 5% each, I murmured. Whitmore nodded. Enough to prove he hadn't abandoned them. But not enough to control anything. Exactly. Robert had given them a place in his legacy, while ensuring they could never destroy it. I sat there quietly absorbing everything. Then another thought occurred to me. Daniel and Clara don't know about this, do they? Whitmore shook his head. No. Will they? That depends. On what? Whitmore met my gaze. On whether they challenge the will. I thought about Daniel's furious expression in the conference room. The way Clara's eyes had narrowed when she realized she wasn't in control. They weren't the type to walk away quietly. They'll challenge it, I said. Whitmore nodded slowly. That's what Robert expected. He slid the final envelope toward me. What's that? I asked. Robert's final instruction. I opened it carefully. Inside was a short note written in the same steady handwriting. If Daniel or Clara attempt to contest this will, the attached evidence must be released to the court immediately. They made their choices long ago. Now they must live with them. Robert. I closed my eyes briefly. Even in death. Robert had been 10 steps ahead. Whitmore closed the folder. Your husband understood the kind of people his children had become. Yes, I said quietly. And he prepared accordingly. Whitmore stood. If Daniel files a legal challenge, this evidence will destroy his case. I nodded slowly. But as I gathered the documents, another thought crept into my mind. If Daniel had betrayed his own father once, what else might he be capable of? Because something about his confidence when he locked me out of the house still didn't make sense. He had been too certain. Too sure that Robert had left everything to him. Which meant one thing. Daniel had believed the company would belong to him. And people who believe they're about to inherit millions usually don't stop at changing locks. The next evening, as I sat alone in Elaine's guest room reading Robert's documents again, my phone rang. It was Whitmore. His voice sounded tense. Margaret, he said. Yes. You were right about something. About what? There was a brief pause. Then he said the words that made my stomach tighten. Daniel filed the legal challenge this afternoon. I wasn't surprised. But Whitmore continued. And there's something else. What? The company's internal audit team just discovered that several financial records were accessed this morning. Accessed by who? Whitmore's voice dropped slightly. Daniel. A cold realization settled over me. Daniel wasn't just angry about the will. He was looking for something. Or maybe trying to hide something. Whitmore spoke again. And Margaret. Yes. You should know something Robert told me a few months before he died. What did he say? Whitmore hesitated, then answered quietly. He believed the twins were capable of far worse than corporate betrayal. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. Robert hadn't just been protecting his company. He had been protecting me. When Daniel filed the legal challenge against Robert's will, I wasn't surprised. In fact, I think Robert had been waiting for it. Daniel had never been the kind of man who accepted defeat quietly. From the moment he believed the company belonged to him, he had already begun acting like its future owner. The locks he changed at the house, the movers he hired, even the way he spoke during the will reading, it all came from certainty. Certainty that he had already won. But Robert had spent his entire life building structures designed to survive hostile attacks. Even attacks from within his own family. And now Daniel had walked straight into the final trap. 2 weeks later, we were sitting inside a courtroom. Daniel had filed a petition claiming Robert's will had been influenced by me. According to his lawyer, Robert had been emotionally manipulated in his final years and had unfairly transferred control of Hale properties to someone who was not part of the bloodline. The irony of that argument almost made me laugh. Clara sat beside her brother, her posture stiff but controlled. Unlike Daniel, she rarely showed emotion. But I could see the tension in the way her fingers gripped the edge of the table. They had expected the court to invalidate the will quickly. Instead, the judge had requested evidence, which meant Robert's final instruction was about to unfold exactly as he planned. Mr. Whitmore stood when the judge signaled for the defense to respond. "Your Honor," he began calmly, "the petitioner has claimed the will was written under undue influence." Mr. Hale anticipated such a claim and left documentation explaining his decisions. Daniel leaned back with a smug expression. He still believed this was routine legal procedure. Whitmore placed a folder on the evidence table. Inside were the documents Robert had spent 5 years collecting. Financial records, communication logs, and one report that Daniel would never see coming. Whitmore began with the financial evidence. These records show that 5 years ago, confidential bid information belonging to Hale Properties was leaked to a competitor. The judge glanced at Daniel. Daniel's confidence didn't fade yet. But it did shift. Whitmore continued. Bank records show that shortly after the failed bid, $200,000 was deposited into an offshore account belonging to Daniel Hale. Now Daniel leaned forward. That money came from a private investment, he snapped. Whitmore calmly held up another document. Then perhaps Mr. Hale can explain why the same account received communication from executives at the company that won the bid. The courtroom grew quiet. Daniel's lawyer quickly stood. Objection. This information is irrelevant to the validity of the will. Whitmore responded immediately. On the contrary, Your Honor. Robert Hale cited this betrayal as one of the reasons he revised his estate distribution. The judge allowed the evidence to remain. For the first time, Daniel looked uncertain. But Whitmore wasn't finished. Not even close. He opened the second folder. Robert Hale also discovered something else during the same investigation. Clara shifted in her seat. Whitmore placed a thin medical report on the table. This document is a certified DNA analysis conducted 5 years ago. Daniel frowned. What does that have to do with anything? Whitmore didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned the document so the judge could read it clearly. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. Then Whitmore spoke the sentence that ended everything. The results confirm that Daniel Hale and Clara Hale are not the biological children of Robert Hale. The room went completely silent. For several seconds, no one moved. Daniel blinked, then laughed. A sharp, disbelieving sound. That's ridiculous. Clara didn't laugh. Her face had gone pale. Whitmore continued calmly. Robert Hale discovered this shortly after the corporate betrayal 5 years ago. He chose not to make the information public at the time. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. This is fabricated. Whitmore slid the lab certification forward. The test was conducted by a licensed laboratory. The chain of custody and authentication are documented. Daniel looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. And in that moment, something terrifying passed between them. Not confusion. Recognition. The truth had just caught up with them. The judge leaned forward slightly. So the deceased was aware these individuals were not his biological children when he wrote the will. Whitmore nodded. Yes, Your Honor. And yet he still left them shares in the company. Yes. Why? Whitmore answered calmly. Because Robert Hale raised them as his children for their entire lives. He simply refused to allow them to destroy what he built. The judge nodded slowly. Daniel stood abruptly. This is character assassination, he snapped. But his voice no longer carried the confidence it had earlier. Whitmore delivered the final piece. Robert Hale also included a clause stating that if the will was challenged, the evidence regarding the leaked bid and the DNA results should be presented to the court. The judge closed the file. I see. Daniel's lawyer whispered something urgently to him. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Then he sat down slowly. Because for the first time he understood something. By challenging the will, he had triggered the release of every secret Robert had hidden. Secrets that destroyed both his credibility and his claim to the estate. The ruling came later that afternoon. The will remained fully valid. Margaret Hale, me, retained 4 to 5% ownership of Hale Properties. Daniel and Clara retained their 5% shares each, bound by every restriction Robert had written. And the evidence of Daniel's corporate betrayal was forwarded for further investigation. The judge closed the case with one final sentence. Robert Hale appears to have anticipated this dispute with remarkable clarity. He certainly had. 2 months later, Daniel was formally charged with corporate fraud related to the leaked bid. Clara avoided criminal charges, but the scandal destroyed her reputation within the company. The board voted to remove both of them from all management roles. They remained minority shareholders, but they had no power, no authority, and no ability to sell their shares without my approval. The day I returned to the house was strangely quiet. The locks had been changed again, this time legally. Daniel and Clara had already moved their belongings out. The movers they hired weeks earlier had unintentionally packed most of their own things instead of mine. I walked slowly through the empty living room. Memories filled every corner. Robert's chair near the fireplace. The long dining table where he once hosted company dinners. The study where he spent countless nights building the business he refused to let anyone destroy. I opened the door and stepped inside. His desk was exactly the way he left it. The safe in the corner stood closed. I sat in his chair and looked around the room. For a moment I imagined him standing beside the window, quietly watching the city he helped build. Robert had carried so many secrets in his final years. Secrets he never shared with me. Not because he didn't trust me, but because he wanted to protect me. Even from the truth about the children he had raised. I opened the safe and placed his letters back inside. Then I whispered softly into the quiet room. You were right about them. And for the first time since his death, I finally understood what Robert meant the night he told me he had taken care of everything. Because he had. Long before Daniel and Clara ever changed those locks.